Welcome to the broadcast tonight. Multi-talented musician Wynton Marsalis will be here with jazz commentator Stanley Crouch to discuss the latest in the world of America's very favorite music, jazz. Also, we'll continue our occasional series on the media with three prominent women in magazine publishing, Grace Mirabella, Ellen Levine, and Alexander Penny. We begin with a rare, detailed history of one of the most important and significant people in American foreign policy over a recent time. In his years as Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger was a key player in international affairs. Even in private life, his opinions are sought by leaders around the world. In a much anticipated and critically acclaimed new biography, Walter Isaacson, an assistant managing editor at Time magazine, offers what may be the most complete look at Dr. Kissinger today, and we're pleased to have him here. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. Good to be here.
It's good to have you. This book, the review in the New York Times by Theodore Draper, it went on and on and on, but it was complete and it was highly praising of you. The interesting, same thing in the Washington Post where Godfrey Hodgson reviewed it. I'm sure there's other reviews. Tell me about the beginning of it for you. You wrote a book called
a friend wrote a book called The Wise Man. And it was about an earlier generation of foreign policy statesmen, the Wise Men, the Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman crowd. And it brought us up to Vietnam. And after that, I wanted to get into the Vietnam era, and Kissinger was the perfect personality as well as intellectual to help us think through what happened to America after Vietnam. And I found a fascinating character, nobody had written a biography of him.
Yeah, he'd written his own memoirs.
He'd written memoirs about his time in power, right, or at least the Nixon years, right, and not the Ford years. But nobody had ever done something on his childhood and as well as his philosophy, as well as his life today.
You had access to him, interviews with him, and he enabled you to talk to friends, associates, people he'd known.
Oh yeah, he was very generous with his time. He also opened the door to President Nixon, President Ford, and I was able to track down other people like President Tu of South Vietnam, the former president there. So I got access to some of most of the people who worked with him, which was good because people like to talk about Kissinger. I mean,
what is it about Kissinger? Because even the reviews that I've read, while praising your scholarship in this biography, also spend a good portion of the review reviewing Kissinger.
Oh, I think you know, if you press a Kissinger button on somebody, just say the word Kissinger, a lot of people they just take off. There's a lot of stories they like to tell. He invokes either a huge amount of animosity on one side or veneration and awe from the other side. He's a controversial figure, and there's very little neutral territory. I mean, people either really revere Kissinger or they just hate him and despise him, think of him as some strange, Lovian, dangerous statesman. So that's one other reason I wanted to do the book is everything about him has either been so pro or so con that I felt it was time to try to take an objective look, to try to look at both sides of it and see what could be said about his life.
Let's talk about the beginning. Born in Germany, came to the United States in the late 30s.
Right, he was born in Fürth, Germany, a suburb of Nuremberg, Orthodox Jewish, beaten up as a child all the time because of the rise of the Nazis and anti-Semitism. He was a soccer fan. He loved going to the soccer games in Fürth. But the Nuremberg laws were passed and Jews were forbidden to go to the soccer games. So he would sometimes take on a fake identity to try to sneak into the games and then get beaten up while he was there. And so he was much smarter than the kids around him, but he was also more beleaguered. And I think it helped develop, it's got to have had an impact, and it developed that mixture of ego and insecurity that pervaded his life.
And that was the shaping influence, you think, that whole sort of having survived the Nazi persecution period?
I think that was one of the many shaping influences of his life. It made him yearn for order. It gave him a sense that power, rather than moral righteousness, helped determine how the world works. And it also, as I say, helped shape that mixture of ego and insecurity that makes you yearn for stability and yearn for acceptance in a new land.
When you talk about biography, and when I do long interviews with people, I'm frequently concerned with and fascinated by influencing people who've had significant influence, whether it's a mentor or someone who's come along at a critical time. Kissinger seems to have a number of people.
Oh yeah, he was great at finding mentors.
Yeah, and Lyndon Johnson was too.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Interesting people in pursuit of power, especially men, and more so I think men than women, because they've had more experience at it, find that person that can advance their career, or that they come together because of that older person's respect for their raw talent. Fritz Kramer was one of the earliest.
Oh, yeah. So Kissinger's in the Army. He had immigrated to the United States, gets drafted, and he's in the infantry in Fort Claiborne, Louisiana. And a Jeep rolls up, cloud of dust, and this guy steps out with a monocle and a walking stick, another refugee from Germany, although not a Jewish refugee. This is a Prussian who had fled Germany and had joined the U.S. Army. And he starts lecturing the troops, because his job is to lecture the troops about why they're going to fight Germany. And afterwards, Kissinger writes him a note saying, Dear Colonel Kramer, this is the way it should be done. So a few days later, the Jeep rolls back, and Colonel Kramer steps out and says, find me Kissinger. So they bring him Henry Kissinger, and Kramer takes Kissinger under his wing, thinks he's one of the brightest people he's met, which is probably true, and makes Kissinger part of the counterintelligence corps and gets him out of the infantry.
And tells him to go to Harvard.
Oh, yes.
It's important that you go to Harvard.
Right. When he finished in the Army, he said, gentlemen should go to Harvard, and he sent Kissinger to Harvard.
Harvard was a seminal influence for Kissinger?
Well, sure. Kissinger spent, I guess he got to Harvard in 48 or so, and he spent almost 20 years at Harvard. At Harvard, he also had a mentor who was a larger-than-life character, Wild Bill Elliott, William Yandell Elliott, who was a professor of government and a great philosopher there. And Kissinger attached himself to Elliott and began running a lot of the programs at Harvard, such as the Harvard Summer Seminar, a certain type of institute there,
a place where it attracted young people in finance and business and economics and academics
from around the world.
And future foreign ministers to come in and sort of teach at Harvard, learn at Harvard. And this suggested what about Kissinger? That he had early on some sense of an aggressive sense about the accumulation of power?
Well, I think he understood how to cater to, if that's not too strong of a word, powerful people. He was able to cater to Fritz Kramer, then William Yandell Elliott, later on Nelson Rockefeller, and of course the greatest of all in his career was Richard Nixon.
I want to get to that real quick, but Kramer, did Kramer in the end grow disillusioned by the career that Kissinger had?
Well, Kramer had these very high standards, perhaps impossible standards, and he loved to march up and down a room. Even when I interviewed him in Washington a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 times, he would march up and down and pronounce and say, this is the way things must be done. And when Kissinger finally came to power, Fritz Kramer was at the Pentagon as an advisor, and he broke with Kissinger because he felt Kissinger hadn't lived up to his standards on how to stay strong against the Soviets.
How does the guy who is a foreign policy advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, who's done some work for Democrats and who
is a
registered Democrat, end up as a national security advisor to Richard Nixon? And what's the key to understanding that relationship?
Well, it was a they were like co-conspirators. They were both very secretive types who sort of fed into each other's dark side. And it began during the 1968 election when the Paris peace talks are going on. Lyndon Johnson is president, and they're trying to get a bombing halt in Vietnam, perhaps to help Humphrey win if they can get some breakthrough at the Paris talks. Kissinger had been an advisor to the Johnson administration informally, and he goes over to Paris and he talks to the people at the Paris peace talks, and he gets a good sense of what's going on. Now, he doesn't spill any secrets, I don't think. He doesn't do anything that was totally dishonorable or illegal, but he does come back and he tells the Nixon campaign. He tells John Mitchell, who is Nixon's campaign manager, and others in the Nixon campaign, his assessment of what is going on in the Paris peace talks, gives them some indication about what they should expect in terms of a bombing halt, and it helps Nixon. Nixon becomes very grateful that secretly Kissinger is passing on information from the other side. And so Kissinger finds almost a kindred spirit there, somebody who's willing to secretly pass on information from the other side. And even though he had only met Kissinger once before, and even though Kissinger had worked for his great rival Nelson Rockefeller, Nixon hires him, surprising everybody, as national security advisor.
But the essence of the relationship was this co-conspirator sense of a they were co-conspirators.
Well, they both liked to do things secretly. They both wanted to cut out the State Department. They were not the types who liked to be inclusive and bring all sorts of people and be open about a decision. And I think they fed off of that in one another. They would sit for hours in the hideaway in the executive office building across from the White House as Nixon ruminated about world affairs, and Kissinger would sort of say, oh, yes, and would help carry out those designs, cutting out the State Department, cutting out the rest of the bureaucracy, cutting out the Foreign Service, and certainly cutting out Congress. And I think they both had that, fed into that secretive nature of one another.
One of the things that people who've written about this book have launched onto is the notion that Nixon said Kissinger should, what, see a psychiatrist?
Oh, I think that they both had great respect for each other's brilliance, or intellectual abilities, but they both were very wary of the other's personality. And Kissinger was prone to fits of anger, some fits of paranoia, which he used to joke about, but they were very real. He was always paranoid that the State Department was out to get him and that they were trying to stab him in the back. He had a great line once. He said, "Everybody in the State Department is trying to stab me in the back except for Bill Bundy. He's still enough of a gentleman to try to stab me in the front." But anyway, I think that Kissinger's almost paranoia and temper and stuff finally got to Nixon. And if you go into the Nixon archives, it's a wonderful trove, but you see all of Haldeman and Ehrlichman's handwritten notes and some of the tape-recorded phone conversations and stuff. And so if you go through those notes of the meetings, you find Nixon saying, we've got to get Henry to see a psychiatrist. I'm going to fire him if he doesn't go see a psychiatrist.
But why? Because what?
Because Kissinger would fly into fits of fury about some things the State Department would do, or, he would just outbreaks of paranoia every now and then.
Kissinger, Biographer Walter Isaacson, a book that has been received enormous praise from reviewers. We'll talk more about the Kissinger impact on American foreign policy and on the world, and some of the things that Walter has to say in the final judgment about the career of Henry Kissinger and what he's doing today in New York. Back in a moment. Stay with us. Let me pull back from this. So first, a little bit more about the analysis of how do you come down in the end in terms of his contribution, the impact he had? A lot of people think that Henry Kissinger, everybody seems to believe that he's one of the more brilliant men who served as Secretary of State and one of the more brilliant men they've ever met. Do you share in that?
Oh, yeah. Like him or not, whether you think he's a strange-loving, dangerous statesman or a brilliant Nobel Peace Prize winner, he had a real concept of foreign policy, unlike most Secretaries of State. He helped with the secret talks that led to America's withdrawal from Vietnam, as messy as that was. The détente with the Soviet Union.
A positive, if you're going to put together a list of the positive and negatives of Kissinger's conduct of foreign policy, either as National Security Advisor or as Secretary of State, would you put the retreat from Vietnam and the way it was handled and the length of time it took to get an agreement as a positive or a negative?
No, I'd put that as a negative in terms of the length of time it took.
Right.
There are 20,000 more Americans killed in Vietnam because of the extra 3 years that we spent there. But
for an agreement that was not much different than what they probably could have gotten.
Different, especially since the agreement didn't hold for more than 2 years. But still, the attempt, and the administration before then had been building up troops in Vietnam. It took them 3 years, Kissinger and Nixon, to get the troops out, but at least they negotiated the withdrawal from Vietnam and did so in a way that preserved America's role in the world. So I think on balance, that was, you wouldn't count it a plus because it took far too long to get us out of Vietnam.
How about the Soviet Union, the relationship with the Soviet Union?
Yeah, the first major first major arms control agreement with the Soviet Union, a détente with the Soviet Union. That détente was not lasting, but while it did last, it was a great thing for U.S.-Soviet relations and world affairs.
And out of office, did former Secretary of State Kissinger recognize changes that were going on early on with some prescience?
Well, no, let me first add that when you talk about the relationship with the Soviet Union, you have to understand it in the balance with the opening to China and the fact that he made it a triangular relationship. What he didn't understand to get to the out of power, or at least in retrospect he was wrong about when he came out of power, was he believed that China was heading towards a more democratic system over the past 5 to 10 years, and that the Soviet Union was becoming more and more of a dangerous adversary, and it turned out the other way around.
The other way around. Did he understand, some say he gave short shrift to, one, economics, and two, to the role of Europe?
Yes, but mainly he gave short shrift, I think, to the role of human rights and to values, which have always been the foundation of American foreign policy. What he was a realist. He understood the balance of power. He had a sense for how a fingertip feel for how power worked in this world. But he didn't have the same appreciation for democracy, human rights, and values as being the foundation of a foreign policy that the United States can make a lasting one.
Because of somehow, either in terms of his academic development or his personal experiences, he had a passion for stability and order.
I think that was bred into his bones from his childhood, from his academic heritage, from his European heritage. He was a realist, a practitioner like Metternich of realpolitik.
Which was the subject of his dissertation.
Which was the subject of his dissertation. He did not believe that sentiment or morality should play a major role in foreign policy.
Has he changed in that? Because his positions on China, he's been on this broadcast and others, and he seems to recognize the role of human rights, but does not believe that for the United States to take a harsher line about human rights will achieve any positive developments in making human rights better for those people in prison in the People's Republic of China.
If you listen to Kissinger talk about human rights, which he does eloquently, either in his speeches in '73 and '74 or on your show in the past 2 years, every talk about human rights is followed by a comma and the word but.
Right.
And whenever he says but, you ought to lean forward because that's what he's saying. And China is a good example. He did not believe that America should sever ties with China. He did not believe we should put sanctions on China after the Tiananmen Square massacre because he believed that a concern for human rights and morality should not determine, and there is some sense to that.
Right.
I mean, it's not an illogical view of the world. We have national interests. China has national interests. It is, in his view, wrong to allow sentiment, morality,
Well, but
to
is
get
it
in between
morality or just sentiment? I mean, he thinks that you can't be romanticized. And he used to say to me and other people that we're interviewing, you can't be romanticized by this love affair with Gorbachev. I mean, what you've got to keep in focus is that this is a relationship between the United States and... Now, is there no morality? You find no morality in his view of the world?
Look, I definitely find a morality in his view in the world because he believes that stability and order is a form of morality. You know, he was at, there was a gathering of Nobel Peace Prize winners not too long after he left office. And it was a private meeting in Paris. And one of them, an Argentinian, got up and accused Kissinger of collective massacre and of genocide and said that he should be ashamed. Nobel Peace Prize.
Because of what, Cambodia?
Because of the
what?
secret bombing of Cambodia, the invasion of Cambodia, the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile. I mean, there's a whole litany of things. Pursuing the Vietnam War, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi, all of these things. Genocide, collective massacre. Kissinger gets up and he says, I know something of genocide and I know something of collective massacre. 13 of my relatives were killed in the Holocaust. The room becomes quiet. So I'm not one who's insensitive to the idea of genocide. But those of us who are statesmen, who actually have to be in the arena, can't aim for perfection. We have to aim for the best balances, the best accommodations we can make in order to get a stable world order. And getting a stable world order, even if it may seem cold and calculating, is a form of morality that may not be as pure as the human rights morality that people on the sidelines, that the moralists and romanticists and sentimental people on the sidelines talk about. But it is a type of morality. And that was a type of morality he pursued.
And that is, but in the end, though, the question of morality and foreign policy and the question of American values is the central indictment that you, Walter Isaacson, as a student of foreign affairs, have against the tenure of Kissinger.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that even people who work closely with him, because I don't consider it just my indictment, but you can even talk to Lawrence Eagleburger or Winston Lord, other people who are his closest aides.
Some who've split with him on issues
like
like
this. Yeah, split with him issues like that, and feel that you really do, you can't, in an open democracy where the people have to support the foreign policy, that the real strength of American foreign policy comes not because of its cleverness, not because of its brilliance, but because it stands for certain fundamental values. And when you look back on it, the reason we won the Cold War was not because of a great balancing of power, it's because of the values of the American system proved more durable.
And it was the passion for those values that fueled the democracy movement, whether it was in the Soviet Union, former Soviet, in Russia, or in Czechoslovakia,
and one of those values,
or by Lech Wałęsa in Poland.
Absolutely, and one of those values is an open and honest foreign policy.
And if you'd say him to that today, would he agree with you that I did not necessarily appreciate those values as an element of foreign policy? Or would he grant your point or not?
I think that he understands the argument. I think he feels it's a bit sentimental, and he would probably say it's a bit naive.
Okay, a couple of things. One, his handling of the press was brilliant.
Absolutely. He's a charming man. He can play him like a fiddle. One of the great things in the Nixon archives are some of these memos from Nixon, who's usually furious that Kissinger's always leaking to the press, always at Georgetown in dinner parties with members of the press. But then Nixon will send a memo saying, I want you to tell your friends in the press how much like Zhou Enlai I am, how we're both, brilliant strategists. And then Kissinger would leak it, and you'd find it in one of the columns the next week, or you'd find it on TV.
Some biography.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, one last point, with a couple of last points. One, there's this wonderful story in which Golda Meir tells the story, is talking to Kissinger about negotiating and about the Golden Rule.
Always, yeah, talking to Nixon and to Kissinger. And,
this is Dolomeier, the former, talking to Nixon and Kissinger about philosophy of negotiating.
Right, and Nixon says, well, I believe in the golden rule in foreign affairs, do unto others as they would try to do unto you. And then Kissinger says, yes, and 10%.
Was he a brilliant negotiator?
I think that he was probably the best negotiator in terms of shuttle diplomacy and even the arms talks with the Soviets, stuff like that we've ever had.
I'm close to time. This book goes all the way up to the contemporary best of to 1992. What do you make of those accusations on 60 Minutes and elsewhere that he is using his good office, meaning the reputation he has, to open doors for businessmen, and that somehow some of that conduct is unbecoming?
I think that it's a lot of people.
Not illegal,
not
unbecoming
illegal.
For a former Secretary of State.
I think that is not as unbecoming as a lot of influence peddlers that used to be in government and turn out to sell their cachet and stuff. I do think that what he does now is he offers strategic insight to companies. He acts as their personal national security advisor to their chairman. And yes, there's a little bit of door opening in there. I think that the conflicts come in mainly because he's a commentator, he writes columns, he goes on TV to talk about China, and yet he has a lot of business relationships in China.
But you got to be fair to him on the other hand, on that point, is that he clearly, I don't believe his opinion is for sale.
Oh, definitely not.
And therefore, what he writes is not because of what his clients might want.
When he supported the Deng Xiaoping regime in China against the charges of against the notion of having sanctions,
it was a position he believed in.
It was a position he believed in deeply, and as Winston Lord, one of his closest aides who broke with him on that issue, said, Henry Kissinger doesn't have to have a cent in financial interests in order to support repressive dictatorships around the world.
Walter Isaacson, it's called Kissinger. It is a book that will generate increasing attention, a fascinating read about foreign policy, America and Vietnam and Watergate, a lot of things we didn't have a chance to get into, including this notion, the fascination with celebrity in America and what role that has played in the career of Henry Kissinger. Walter, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you here.
On the show.